This is Chapter 20 of Hattie Big Sky by Kirby Larson. September 1918. The Arlington News. Honyaker's Homily, Matters of Age. So much fuss about age. Men can enlist in the service at 18, but cannot vote until age 21. Women are thought old maids at 24. My time on the prairie has shown me that age has very little to do with one's mental acuity or physical ability. My old hen neighbor, her own label for herself, is sought after like a debutante at a grand ball for her horse training skills. Rooster Jim claims to be near to 60, and he puts in days that would send a younger man straight to his bed. And the youngsters, 12-year-old girls drive wagons, and 16-year-old boys are left in charge of farms while their fathers go east for work. I myself have been under the able tutelage of a boy just turned 9. Without Chase's wisdom, I might not have made it through even my first day as a Honyaker. It seems unfair not to give credit where credit is due, simply because one lacks a certain number of candles on one's birthday cake. Every woman in the country, probably spent the same sleepless night I did on September 11. I finally gave up, got up, and made coffee. Too early even to do my chores, I drank the coffee black, sitting on my steps, watching the sky blush the palest pink. In a few hours at 7 a.m., registration day would start, the third of the war. President Wilson was calling for 13 million men ages 18 to 45 to enroll. "Let's finish what we have begun," trumpeted the herald. I sipped my coffee and thought about Mabel Wren. Elmer had already registered. Would he be drafted, leaving her all alone with those 6 kids and that big farm? At least their crops were in. Mrs. Martin had asked for prayers on Sunday for those about to enlist. Sounded like she couldn't hold Traft back any longer. He'd probably be the first in line. My mind brought up a picture of all the men from Vida who would be registering. I said a prayer for each of them by name, asking that if any of them got drafted, they would all come back to their homes and families. I thought of Charlie's last letter. Perhaps he'd meant it to be light, but the story he related only added to my worries. I had a job a little out of the ordinary today. Was detailed to guard the target range. That is, the target that the aeroplanes practice shooting at. One of the English chaps asked me if I had stood sentry before. On my reply in the negative, he said, "Don't worry, the safest place is at the target." Guess he doesn't think much of the pilot's aim. But at the end of the letter, he had drawn 15 stars. I knew that meant he'd lost 15 more comrades. I had tried to write about my conflicted feelings in the last Arlington News installment. Mr. Miltenberger sent it back to me. "Our readers want homestead stories," he wrote, "not philosophy." I'd quickly written up a piece about harvest and dutifully sent that in. The check arrived, so I guessed it passed muster. I leaned against the doorframe. If I was this fatigued from one night's loss of sleep, how did Charlie and the other soldiers feel, wakeful night after night after night? Fingers of deeper pink stretched across the sky. I couldn't help but watch it turn from rose to red to purple to blue. Etched against that changing and endless sky, I saw an eagle. Its wings spread strong and wide. It flew lazy loops above the prairie. Suddenly it dived down, down, down. Then it rose sharply. Something, a sage hen, was trapped in its talons. The eagle screamed to announce his success. then flew toward a distant butte. I strained to watch and finally lost it in the rising sun. A Sunday school verse came back to me. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. I stood up. Even though I was both weary and faint, I still had a horse to turn out to pasture and morning chores to do. And I would do them on 2 tired legs, not on eagle's wings. I was restaking my green beans when I heard a rider approaching. I glanced up, shielding my eyes from the sun with my vine-stained right hand. It was Rooster Jim. "Come on in and have some coffee." I dropped my hoe and stepped toward him as he trotted Ash into the yard. He wore an odd expression, one I couldn't read. "This isn't a social visit, Hattie." After he swung down off Ash, he seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time brushing prairie dust from his pants. "Is something wrong? Is it Paralee?" I wiped my hands on my grimy apron. "The baby?" No, they're all right." He wrapped Ash's reins around the saddle horn. The silky gray horse nibbled at some clover that was taking over my onions. "Mr. Ebgerd wanted me to tell you, wanted you to know right away." I edged toward him. "Jim, you'd best tell me right out and be done with it." He tugged off his hat. "It's Martin," he said, working his hands around its brim. "He's contested your claim." "What?" I exhaled hard. "I don't understand. What's that mean?" "It happens. A couple months ago, Lisa Edwards, over by Cow Creek, got her claim contested by a neighbor. Said she wasn't really living on the place, wasn't fulfilling the residency requirement. "But I live here," I sputtered. "Have since I came out." "Well, it's not your living here that Traft's challenging." Rooster Jim ducked his head and spoke to his shoe tops. "It's your age." A warmth crept up from my chest over my neck to the top of my head. "Age?" Jim lifted his head. "See, unless you're the head of household, you've got to be 21 to file a claim. But Uncle Chester filed. Traft says he had no right to leave you something he didn't really own." "Is that true?" I rubbed my forehead. "About leaving it to me?" Jim cleared his throat. "Technically, probably." My head felt so light I thought I might faint. "But why?" I asked. Don't know why I did. I knew the answer. Traft couldn't grow the biggest ranch around, hemmed in by Hanyackers like me. He'd probably been cooking this up since I turned him down that first day. Oh, why had I been so smart to him? Maybe if I'd been a little more civil. What do I do? Here's how it works. Mr. Ebgerd hears the case because he's the closest land official. Traft tried to get him to make a ruling today, but Ebgerd said you had the right to be heard, too. Uncle Chester's letter came back to me. "I trust you've enough of your mother's backbone." Did I have enough for another fight? "So I have to go to Wolf Point?" Jim nodded. "When?" "Tomorrow." "But that's no time to—" I stopped myself. To do what? Age 5 years? I couldn't change the fact that I was 16. Well, almost 17, come October 28. "Do you want me to go with you?" Jim asked. I thought it over. I did. I wanted him and Carl and Paralee and Leafy, all my friends. I wasn't sure I did have enough backbone to face Traft one more time, but I couldn't bear the thought of having my friends watch me lose my claim. And to Traft Martin. "Thanks, but I'll go on in myself." Rooster Jim patted my shoulder as he left. "However it comes out, you should be real proud of yourself, Hattie. Real proud." I thought about that as I got ready for bed. What good was being proud when you didn't have a roof of your own to be proud under? The bell jingled as I entered Mr. Ebgerd's office. He hopped right up and found me a chair. "Afternoon, Mr. Ebgerd." I kept my chin up, helped to hold back the tears. "I'm real sorry about all this, Hattie." He fussed with some papers on his desk. "Part of the job." "I know." I lifted my chin another inch. "Shall we get started?" He sighed. "I guess we'd better." The bell jingled again. Traft Martin swaggered inside. He made a big show of tipping his hat to me. "Good afternoon, Miss Brooks." A curt nod was all I would give him. Mr. Ebgerd reached behind him and flipped through his files. He fumbled around so long that Traft began to rock on his feet. "Come on, Ebgerd, can't be that many B's." A few more moments, and Mr. Ebgerd pulled out a file. "Let me review my notes." Traft slammed down on an empty chair. "What's to review?" He jerked his thumb toward me. "She isn't 21. Plain and simple. She admitted as much to witnesses." I opened my mouth to answer, but Mr. Ebgerd interrupted. "When is your next birthday, Miss Brooks?" "Coming up. End of October. October 28th. Mr. Ebgerd scribbled something down. "Now you can bake her a cake." Traft leaned forward on the chair. "Her birthday isn't the question here. It's her age. Ask her how old she is." "I'm in charge of this hearing," said Mr. Ebgerd, "and you'd best let me run it my way, Mr. Martin, or I will reschedule this hearing for October 29th. I couldn't stop my smile. I still wouldn't be old enough on October 29, but I saw what Mr. Ebgerd was trying to do. "Now, Miss Brooks, will you please tell me where you were born?" "Oh, for crying out!" Traft slapped his hand on his thigh. "Your birthplace?" Mr. Ebgerd continued calmly. "And year?" "Arlington, Iowa," I answered. "October 28th, 1901. "See?" Traft closed his eyes to do the math. "That makes her 16, nowhere near old enough." "Who are your parents?" Mr. Ebgerd asked. "Raymond and Catherine Brooks," I answered. He nodded and made a note. "But they are no longer living." I touched Mother's watch, pinned to my blouse. "Oh?" Mr. Ebgerd scribbled something else. "So who is your guardian?" I chewed on my lower lip. "No one, sir. I mean, different folks took me in, but I didn't have anyone official like that." "No guardian?" Mr. Ebgerd's pencil poised above the paper. "No." "Would you say your upbringing was different from most girls your age?" he asked. "Cut this tea party talk and get down to business." Mr. Ebgerd raised his eyebrow at Traft. "Your upbringing?" he prompted. I thought about it for a minute. Mr. Ebgerd's questions were even beginning to puzzle me. What did any of this have to do with my homestead claim? Well, I guess it was fine. I mean, I didn't have folks to fuss over me like some girls I know. Mildred Powell, for one. If she even got one sniffle, her mother put her to bed and waited on her hand on foot. I guess I learned to do for myself sooner. How much sooner, would you say? How much? I wrinkled my forehead. Then I smiled. I saw exactly where Mr. Ebgerd was headed. I decided to play along. "Oh, 5 or 6 years, I'd say," I nodded. "Yes, definitely 5 or 6 years." "Ebgerd!" Traft looked ready to explode. 5 or 6 years. Mr. Ebgerd scribbled furiously on his paper. "Very interesting." He scribbled some more. I glanced over at Traft. He was rolling a cigarette, dropping tobacco on Mr. Ebgerd's office floor. The cigarette was finished by the time Mr. Ebgerd spoke again. "Mr. Martin," he began, Traft shifted in his chair, dropped the cigarette in his pocket, and smirked at me. Mr. Martin, while the law does specify an age of majority in order to file a homestead claim, yes, and it's not 16, it also provides for the ability for a single woman, head of household, to file. Some might infer that the majority age applies in such a case, which it does. Traft jumped up. It looked as if he'd figured out where Mr. Edgard was going to. I am going to rule that the head of household status takes precedence over the age requirement, and as Miss Brooks has herself explained, her 16 years are the equivalent of 21 years for other girls raised under more fortuitous circumstances. Mr. Edgard scribbled one final time on the paper. I find this contestation has no merit. I fought the urge to throw my arms around Mr. Edgard's neck. I was so happy I probably would have squeezed the life out of him. I get to keep my claim! Well, to be accurate, you may continue to work to prove up on it. He smiled. Edgard, don't be a fool. Traft ran his hand over his face. We'll see what the Council of Defense has to say about this. You know, she's awful friendly with Carl Mueller, and I've seen her out at the Wren place, and I know that Miss Brooks has loyally purchased Liberty bonds and war stamps. Mr. Edgard was standing now. At great personal sacrifice, I would be very careful about making any accusations along those lines about her. He leaned forward across the desk. I thought there might be blows, so I jumped up. No hard feelings, Mr. Martin? I stuck out my hand. Traft looked as if he might spit in it. He turned on his heel and slammed out the door. I held my breath as the window glass in the door rattled, then stilled. I turned to Mr. Edgard. I can't thank you enough. Nor I you, he said. Now you go home and do what you need so I can give you that final certificate come November. Give, I teased. For $37.75, you mean? I'll take great personal pleasure in taking your cash and in signing my name to your deed. He reached for his hat. Would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner? My treat. Where I couldn't have eaten a bite before coming in, I was suddenly starving. I'd love to. I took his arm and we strolled over to Erickson's hotel and ate the biggest dinner they served.